Hi, welcome back to Educator.com. This is lichens, a closer look. Alright, so I'm going to give you a little intro on lichens, but first, if you're wondering what's with this lesson, this seems kind of random, I chose to do a lesson on lichens in AP Environmental Science here on Educator.com because lichens are one of those fascinating organisms that, even in a biology class, the study of life, you don't typically hear that much about. It's kind of a side note when you're talking about fungi or algae or symbiosis. But I decided to do a lesson on lichens because they really apply to every branch of environmental science when you really consider all the different parts that we go over in this course. And I'll give you plenty of examples of all the ways it relates to AP Environmental Science. So, if you're wondering what are these things, well, they're a composite organism from a symbiotic relationship. Technically, it's two different species living together. It's always going to be a fungus, usually a sac fungus, the Ascomycota group, but not always, with algae and or cyanobacteria. So, usually it's a sac fungus, like I said, but occasionally you'll have what's called a basidiomycete, a relative of mushrooms that's actually a part of this relationship. And it's symbiotic because the fungus is always, in a sense, cradling or holding single-celled algae, which are actually eukaryotic. You know, they would have chloroplasts and the like, or cyanobacteria, which is nicknamed blue-green algae, but that is a prokaryotic organism. It is bacteria that's able to do photosynthesis. And actually, some lichens will have both algae and cyanobacteria. But that's definitely what all lichens have in common, is that combination. And a little bit later, I'll talk about how the symbiosis is not always mutualism. There are some exceptions to that rule. There are thousands of species, and they come in many shapes and sizes. And the reason why I wrote species in quotations like that, it's funny naming a lichen because, like I mentioned a moment ago, you've got the fungus and you've got the algae. So technically it's two different organisms, but we're choosing just one name. When you look at the classification of lichens, typically it's the fungus that has inspired the name of the particular kind of lichen. And yeah, many shapes and sizes. Here are some examples. Some of them look like little just crusty mounds on rocks. Others look like almost like miniature bushes, and some look straight up like leaves. A lot of variety, and I'm going to give you some more examples of that later on in this lesson. They can live in almost any environment, on anything. From the ocean to the desert to way up on the top of mountains, in the tundra, and on anything. I mean, we're talking rocks, we're talking buildings, we're talking on bark, soil, even on top of other lichens. It's pretty interesting, all the places you can find them. And like I mentioned a moment ago, they are found from sea level to alpine environments. All different latitudes, all different altitudes. A lot of them are just very tolerant of various environmental conditions. These are not moss. Moss is not related to these. Moss is actually in kingdom Plantae. It's a non-vascular plant. But I wanted to point this out because a lot of the nicknames, whether it's oak moss or reindeer moss is another example, they're actually a kind of lichen. It's a misnomer, this right here. It's misnamed. The name actually doesn't make sense based on what it really is. So reindeer moss is actually a kind of lichen that reindeer like to eat. And they're related to environmental science in many ways, like I suggested at the beginning of this slide. Here's just a few quick examples. One of the ways, the nitrogen cycle. If you consider the nitrogen cycle discussed earlier in this course, lichens actually do a great deal of getting nitrogen out of the air, out of its atmospheric form, and into a compound that then can be transferred to other organisms. A lot of times when lichens die on the soil, the breakdown of their bodies will then provide nitrogenous compounds in the soil for the plants surrounding it. Without the lichen there, the plant wouldn't have been able to incorporate the nitrogenous compounds into its own body. Another example, pollution. I'll relate pollution to lichens later on in this lesson. And then besides that, succession. So whether it's primary succession or secondary succession, I'll just speak on primary here, lichens have to do with that. For instance, let's say you have some new ground that is developed. It's from some volcanic explosion. You have the cooling of lava, and you've got that lava rock there. One of the first plant-like organisms that ends up colonizing that lava rock is lichens. Before it gets soft enough where true roots can penetrate in there and you can have, bigger grasses, bushes, trees, one of the first stages of succession is getting lichens there. So in many ways, lichens pave the way, literally, for bigger plants and other organisms to come in. So when it comes to succession, lichens are a very, very important organism.